early film sound recordings of musical stars, old musical stars, that were made in the early 1930s. And Music Hall will be one of the things that we'll be talking about today. My thanks to Juhi, who saved my life this morning. She sent me an email last night to say that the link was down. And I was busy last night, so I couldn't really, attend to it. Woke up this morning, realised I'd written the wrong lecture for today. I'd written like next Tuesday's lecture for today. So this morning has been one of rather frantic preparation to get back on track. That has the consequence of the fact that I may well go beyond 12 o'clock because it wasn't the lecture that I thought. So if anyone wants to go out to the rally at 12 o'clock, that's absolutely fine. I promise that I will not say anything, and the lecture is likely to go a little beyond that. And I do actually believe that our Governor, Joey Brown, and indeed our university president, Mark Udolph, would actually like as large attendance as possible in Sproul Plaza today, because that helps them make the case for more public investment in our universities and in our schools. Okay, party political broadcast over. So I'm going to talk to you today basically about the reform of popular culture in Britain in the second half of the 19th century up to the First World War. And there were two books written by historians of Britain about the late 18th and early 19th century. One was called A Polite and Commercial People. Okay. The other was called A Mad, Bad and Dangerous People. Okay. So part of what I'm going to be trying to do today is trying to reconcile these two completely different accounts of the nature of British society, even though they were writing about a earlier time. And I'm going to say that it was neither one or the other, basically that it was a bit of both. And so in that sense, this lecture is rather like the lecture on the transformation of the electoral system, which is to say it tracks the way in which an old customary system is gradually reformed and transformed. And yet elements of that old system continue to have a strong influence, and indeed a whole new set of traditions get invented in the process. The end point is that we have, in the early 20th century, a modern popular culture that is recognizable even to young Californians in the 21st century. Okay? What emerges by the first decade of the 20th century is a form of popular culture, or the forms of popular culture that will be recognizable to you today. And indeed many of the same forms, like, for instance, I'll talk to you about organized sport and soccer, and that's probably why I won't be able to finish as early as I would like to. So the question is, how do we get there? How do we get from this customary culture, which I'll describe in a moment, to this recognizable sort of modern popular culture? And I'm basically going to suggest that there are these three big processes or three great forces of reform. Religion and moral reform that provides a new idea of rational recreation, the transformation of popular culture into leisure as a commodity, i.e. popular culture as a commercial enterprise, and finally the appearance of a new type of mass culture, which is partly about commercialization, but it's also partly about national standardization. The standardization of a culture across the nation, erasing local or displacing local differences. and then I'll say something completely profound to conclude. So first off, let's go back to what this customary culture is that reformers are so eager to get away from. Here we have a image of, anyone know what this is? What's going on here in this picture? A cockfight, indeed. Something that still indeed goes on, I believe, in certain quarters of the US and even in Britain. Here we have a cockfight that is characterized, as you can see, by all the things that reformers came to hate. Okay? Violence between animals, cruelty to animals, a good deal of drinking. Smoking, of course, hadn't by this time even begun to be something that one shouldn't do. It's collective, it's disorderly, and it's highly localized. And people are betting on which cock is going to win. My money is actually on this guy. Look at that pose. He looks ready to leap. Okay, so basically all of these things are alcohol, violence, gambling, cruelty, disorderly conduct. All of these things come to represent, a tad unfairly, the old customary culture. The other key part of this is, the other key element of that old customary culture was that there was no clear separation between work time and leisure time. There was not such a strict regulation of our working days and our working weeks, and people could indeed engage in a spot of leisure at work even. Nip out for a quick, you could read on the job, you could maybe nip out for a quick game of something. There was no clear division between the world of work and the world of leisure. So what I'm going to do now is move on to the first big force of reforming movement upon this customary culture, and then at the end of that I'll stop for questions. That is extraordinarily late to arrive, at 11:18. So let's start here by reminding ourselves of the big anxiety about a potential process of secularization that had been revealed in the 1851 census. When you remember, there was a census day on a Sunday to test how many people were going to church. And you'll recall that basically only 41% of the population attended a place of worship, and most of those were, 41% attended a place of worship, and most of those were not Anglicans, not part of the established church. And you'll remember that the big thing I went on about a few weeks ago was that the majority of the people not attending happened to be the urban working class. Okay? So the question was suddenly posed in an acute way, without the traditional mooring of religion and of the Anglican Church. Where was suitable moral government of the population going to come from? Where are people going to get their moral compass from, if not from religion and the church? Now, that anxiety ended up being grossly overestimated, which is to say that even though people were increasingly not going to church, this is true, nonetheless the church continued to have an absolutely central place in British cultural life. And you can see that most clearly in the way in which key rites of passage in people's lives continue to be conducted through the auspices of the church. So 90% of marriages, 75% of baptisms, all the way down to the First World War. And 1904 is the peak year of attendance at religious institutions. Now that's not telling you a whole lot, remember, because the population had grown so rapidly that greater numbers in 1904 doesn't actually represent a greater proportion of the population attending a place of worship. The other great anxiety here is one that, again, we're very familiar with even in the 21st century in California, is the anxiety that followed the moving away from an idea of natural theology. That is, that God's divine plan not only created the world, but also ordered it. Okay, so Darwin's The Origin of the Species in 1859 is the canonical text that we now associate with the challenge to that worldview, to say that nature has its own evolutionary rhythms and logics, characterized by a process of natural selection. But Darwin is not the first person to begin to articulate that view. Okay? He comes at the end of several decades of, if you like, thought experiments of what would it mean to imagine a world not created by God. Nonetheless, for Victorians, this is a huge and dramatic event and revelation. I want to emphasize, however, that it doesn't mean that suddenly everybody stops believing in God. I think, okay, science has shown us this, now we don't have to think that God is a part of our lives. Quite the reverse was true. Indeed, in many ways, what you see in the later parts of the 19th century is an increase in interest in science, in religion as a type of science. So you have the development of things like occultism, like spiritualism, like theosophy, which try and do, if you like, scientific experiments on the spiritual world. Okay? And I'll talk to you more about that in a later lecture. The point to grasp is simply that religion continues to be a central part of British culture, even if it isn't necessarily under the auspices of the Anglican Church. Now, of course, the other thing that is going on here is that the crisis of the Anglican Church was not matched by a crisis of the so-called dissenting or non-conformist churches. That is, all those churches that are outside the Anglican fold, like the Congregationalists, the Baptists, the Methodists, even the Catholics, and a range of other groups as well, just naming you the largest ones. Indeed, in the first half of the 19th century, all of those groups, the congregations of all of those groups and the numbers of chapels and places of worship that they built grew very dramatically. So, for instance, between 1801 and 1851, Methodist chapels increased by 14 times. Okay, dramatic growth. One way to think about this, or one way to measure it, is by the increasing numbers of kids attending Sunday schools. Did anyone in this room attend a Sunday school? Yeah? It's still going strong. Sunday schools, amazingly, reached 2 million, a population of 2 million by 1851. Okay? That's basically starting from a base of 60,000 in 1788. Okay, so 2 million kids attending the school population. That basically equates to over 50% of children ages between the ages of 5 and 15, and 75% of working class children. Okay? Sunday schools are enormous, and they speak to the growth of this evangelical fervour known as the revival. Okay, that had been developing momentum since the late 18th century. Now, this evangelical revival creates in turn a whole series of organizations for the diffusion of Christian knowledge and for the moral reform of the population. So I've given you a long list there of